With a new set out, we have a new problem. The One Ring is tearing up every format that it's legal in, so to no surprise it goes in Vintage's best deck easily as a 4-of. The game plan is simple: use the most powerful mana sources of all time to cast a big bomb on turn 1. As all our expensive artifacts draw cards, we can use them to cast Phyrexian Metamorph to copy them. As you can see here, you can get some pretty explosive games with just this game plan, but to make it over the top, we have 4 Force of Will to protect our combos. The rest of the deck is full of some one-of broken cards that are restricted in Vintage, and any of these cards that you don't know I will clarify during the video. Oh, and also, don't forget to subscribe. While it might not mean much to you, sponsors do look at this number, and it helps me get more money to help me keep doing this as my job. To start the first round, we're on the draw and we have a great opening hand because we have both Force of Will and Ancestral Recall. Now there is a slight problem in that we don't have a blue source, but we can either draw it off the top of the deck, or get a Black Lotus with Urza's Saga on our third turn. With a Grim Monolith off the top, I play my Urza's Saga and pass back. The opponent plays a Forbidden Orchid, and we find the One Ring off the top of the deck. Now I have the choice between playing my Ancient Tomb and passing, or playing the Grim Monolith and the One Ring, but I decide to play my Ancient Tomb and pass, and this is because the opponent plays a lot of must counter cards, and I don't particularly want to play the One Ring and then have to force back, and then the opponent plays an Atraxa which I can't counter. And speaking of an Atraxa, my opponent plays Mox Ruby and then casts Show and Tell. This is screaming Atraxa, because they probably have one in hand, and they can just put it into play with the Show and Tell. Now something nice about Show and Tell is that I can put the One Ring into play. So what I can do here is Force of Will the Show and Tell. If they do have a way to fight back, I still have some compensation because the One Ring will draw me a lot of cards. Now the One Ring draws me a lot of cards, but Atraxa is going to draw the opponent way more. Now for those keyboard warriors telling me I should put Phyrexian Metamorph into play to copy the Atraxa, that doesn't work because the Phyrexian Metamorph won't see it. Now something you might have noticed, the One Ring did not trigger when I put it into play with Show and Tell. Of course that gives us protection from everything until the next turn, and this is because the One Ring says if you cast it, you get protection from everything. We didn't cast it, we put it into play with Show and Tell. What's nice with the Atraxa is they do not find a Force of Will, so when we untap, the opponent is most likely not going to have a counter, and we're drawing a lot of cards here. While they don't have a counter though, they do have a Force of Vigor which will destroy our Urza's Saga, which is bad for us here because we wanted to get Black Lotus. What is good though is we have access to Mox Opal, which is blue mana, as well as we can now Phyrexian Metamorph the Atraxa when it's on the battlefield. Our One Ring does draw us a Mana Crypt and a Grim Monolith, so now we have a ton of mana, we're drawing a ton of cards, we should be locking up this game. Things do get a bit interesting when we cast a Phyrexian Metamorph and the opponent does have a Force of Will. While I could Ancestral Recall in response, we actually don't have a lot of blue cards in the deck, so I'm just going to force pitch Ancestral, get this down, get the Atraxa resolved, and try and win the game. With both a Tinker and a Paradoxical Outcome, both being a sorcery in an instant, we can take both of them from the Atraxa trigger plus Black Lotus. I think it's very clear to me what's going to happen. We're going to play all of the cards in our hand, we're going to cast Paradoxical Outcome to bounce everything to our hand, we're going to replay everything with a load more cards, and then try and take infinite turns. If you don't know how this infinite turns combo works, it's super simple. Ignore everything on the Time Vault apart from the fact you can tap it to take an extra turn. So if we pay 1 mana to untap the Time Vault, we can tap it to take an extra turn. And then on our next turn, we'll untap all our mana and the Manifold key, so then we can untap the Time Vault to take an extra turn. You can do this as many times as you like, and win the game. Boarding in this matchup is really complicated, and that's because we do nothing. Anyways, going into game 2, we have a great opening 7. With the opponent playing a Polluted Delta and passing back the turn, and a Mox off the top of the deck, I'm going to play the vast majority of the cards in my hand and hold up Paradoxical Outcome on the opponent's turn because there's a potential chance they have Force of Negation as their counterspell instead of Force of Will, which they can only cast on my turn. At first I thought my opponent's missing their land drop, but they're doing the classic play in Vintage of playing Ancestral Recall in your second main phase to hope the opponent F6 out of Force of Will. So in response, my only play here is to Paradoxical Outcome and hope that they don't have a Force. The opponent does have Force of Will, resolves Ancestral Recall, plays their second land drop and passes back the turn. But like an absolute beast, we find Coveted Jewel off the top of the deck. Now it's time to combo kill the opponent as we can play the Right, the Ancestral Recall, double Force of Will draw. Very rough for us. They untap, play an enchantment that essentially says that you can't draw any cards additional to your draw step, and we lose. Vintage, woo! After being that salty F&M opponent that got mana screwed game 1 and cried like a baby to proceed to get extremely lucky in games 2 and 3, I actually have an amazing opening 7. With multiple 1-of restricted cards, I think it's clear to see why this hand is extremely powerful and I don't need a Force of Will. As we are on the play and I have a 1 ring, I'm going to cast the 1 ring and see if the opponent has a counter. Both playing my Black Lotus and my Mox, the 1 ring hits the table. Now the 1 ring's on the table, we can draw a card which finds Mishra's Workshop, and as I know the opponent doesn't have a Force of Will, I can play Trinisphere and instantly win the game. Trinisphere is not a great Magic card in Modern and Legacy, but in Vintage it is extremely broken. In a format where it's easy to have upwards of 4 to 5 mana on the first turn, surprisingly, a 3 mana artifact that essentially says your opponent can't do anything for the rest of the game is very broken. Obviously in Modern and Legacy, it's harder to get down turn 1, but in Vintage, it is very easy to get down turn 1. Now I want to show you a match where the 1 ring is so insanely broken it wins the game on its own. Here we go, a casual turn 1 1 ring hand because Mishra's Workshop and the 1 ring is so insanely powerful because it essentially makes the 1 ring 1 mana. The opponent does have Force of Will, but I have Force of Will back, and now I'm about to draw a billion cards. And that's about it. With the 1 ring being indestructible, there are answers for the 1 ring in Vintage, like Pithing Needle, or maybe Teferi Time Raveler Bounce. But these are unconventional cards, especially game 1 to have if they can't Force of Will the 1 ring. So while the opponent does have Ragavan and Time Walk and Expressive Iteration, all very powerful Magic cards, they just can't do anything against the 1 ring. And when I eventually draw a Tinker and a Time Walk, the opponent is done and they concede the game. Going into game 2, I do have a counter back for the opponent's counter on my 1 ring, but they do end up having a Pithing Needle to name the 1 ring. So after trading my Hull Breacher for the opponent's Ragavan, we are now in a top deck war. And what's bad for me in this top deck war is that the opponent has Lurrus in their companion zone. For those who don't know, Lurrus was unbanned in Vintage after the companion rule was changed. But then my opponent makes one of the most questionable plays I've seen in Vintage in a long time. They have Underworld Breach off the top of the deck, and out of all of the cards they choose to cast from their graveyard, they play Lotus Petal. I was thinking that they were playing the Lotus Petal because they want double white for the Lurrus in the companion zone, so at first I thought that was a decent play, and then the opponent never put Lurrus into their hand for the rest of the game. So very questionable Underworld Breach. After winning this match, I went on to play one of the craziest Vintage matches I've played in a long time, and this is because I was actually streaming on Twitch. Now this was game 3 against Initiative, and I just comboed on the previous turn, but didn't get there, so I had to kill their creatures, and then I got to untap because the opponent just played 1 Initiative creature. I lose. I lost. I whiffed on all of my cards. If you don't know here, the Seasoned Dungeoneer gets protection from creatures when it attacks, and the way Coveted Jewel is worded, although I get protection from the 1 ring, Coveted Jewel says if the creature is not blocked. So while the Seasoned Dungeoneer can't deal damage to me because of the 1 ring, it doesn't care because the Coveted Jewel is going to give the opponent 9 cards, 9 mana, and as the opponent's deck is designed to beat my deck, there'll be many ways to both exile the Wormcoil with Solitude, Swords to Plowshares, there'll be so many ways from preventing me from casting spells next turn. I am essentially dead here. So all I can do is play both of my Wormcoil engines and pass the turn, and pray that the opponent whiffs on 9 cards from my Coveted Jewels and the 1 card in their draw step. But then another dynamic changes. The opponent is somehow AFK, and they go AFK for over 5 minutes. How long is the timer? It's like 10 minutes, right?
I think it's 8 minutes for leagues and 15 for...
I mean, there's no way this guy doesn't come back in 8 minutes. So my opponent has 8 minutes here to reconnect. If they don't come back in 8 minutes, then the game will automatically resign them. So I think what happened was my opponent saw me comboing, saw that I went AFK because I actually whiffed on all the cards and didn't know what to do. They thought I was BMing them and they just left their computer. So let's see what happens. This is actually quite tense. If he comes... Yes! Yes! He didn't come back! Wow, Twitch chat, let's go! Oh my gosh. We actually would have lost, but we win. Oh my gosh. Okay. I will take that. I will take that any day of the week. Let's open these chests for the gambling degenerates. Oh my god. Oh my god. Electrosonic Pummeler, that goes way back with me in Standard. Wow. Don't forget to like and subscribe those on YouTube. Don't forget to follow my Twitch. I'm streaming now in a bit.